Our keynote speaker tonight really needs no introduction. Here are just a few of the reasons why. Cokie Roberts is a political commentator for ABC News and NPR, and is, quite simply, a living legend in American broadcasting. That's not just my opinion. The Library of Congress named her a living legend in 2008. She's won 3 Emmys, is in the Broadcasting and Cable Hall of Fame, and was named one of the 50 greatest women in the history of broadcasting by the American Women in Radio and Television. But broadcasting is not the only thing that Cokie Roberts has done superlatively. She's the author of 6 New York Times bestsellers, most of them recounting the remarkable contributions of women to this country's founding and its preservation, starting with her wonderful book, Founding Mothers, followed by Ladies of Liberty and Capital Dames. I can't help observing that, given this publication record, it's an especially happy coincidence that our symposium starts tonight on the International Day of Women. Cokie Roberts also does family really well. With her husband, journalist Stephen Roberts, she writes a weekly syndicated column, and the two of them collaborated on From This Day Forward, a book about their marriage of more than 50 years. She's the mother of 2, the grandmother of 6, and she's the daughter of 2 remarkable Louisianans, Hale and Lindy Boggs, who successively represented Louisiana in Congress for nearly 50 years. Now, Cokie Roberts has one more really important claim to fame. She is, as you've heard, a native New Orleanian. And even though she doesn't live here anymore, I've heard her call this place home over the airways more times than I can count. And when she does that, she pronounces the name of the city like a New Orleanian. This is important. No native Orleanian ever says New Orleans. Louis Armstrong sang it, but he never said it. That's definitely the one way not to say the name of our hometown. But if you're from here, you also know that there is definitely no one way to say it. The pronunciations are as diverse and idiosyncratic as the city itself. There is New Orleans, New Orleans, New Orleans. Some people give 3 syllables to the second part, New Orleans, which actually comes pretty close to the way the French say the name of our city, La Nouvelle-Orléans. There's one other variation that Cokie must have heard, the Greek one, Nea Orleani, because some years back she lived with her family in Greece. I heard Nea Orleani too, because before I migrated into history, the 18th century, I was an archaeologist in Greece, and I'm 99% sure that we were both in Athens the summer that the deposed dictators went on trial. I got tear gassed, I hope Cokie didn't, and I watched this drama unfold on TV with Greek friends. There was a lot of yelling, and instead of a gavel, there was something like a bicycle bell that they'd ring to try and get people to be quiet. I have to say it was, well, Watergate was really tame by comparison to that trial. So I want to ask, what are the chances of 2 New Orleans girls sharing the stage at McAllister Auditorium, both knowing how the Greeks would pronounce the name of our hometown? But that's New Orleans and New Orleanians for you. We are citizens of the world, and the rest of the world wishes they were citizens of New Orleans. I feel like I've known Cokie Roberts for a long time, even though we never met until just tonight, a few minutes ago. And I have to tell you, I had every reason to be completely petrified about introducing the rock star of NPR. But we both call New Orleans home, and that makes all the difference. Join me, please, in giving a warm welcome to Cokie Roberts.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Emily, for that lovely introduction. It really is an honor to be here doing this, and I'm really sorry that Sybil Morial isn't here. I talked to her today. She's been in a car crash, but she says she's going to be fine and she's going to be back. But I'm here because, of course, Sybil asked me to be, and I don't remember ever saying no to anything she asked me to do. Mama would have killed me, and I've never been sorry about that. Our families have been close for such a long time, and Mama always said, Sybil's the one who should run. So it makes me sad that she's not here. Priscilla Lawrence's work at the Historic New Orleans Collection has been quite extraordinary, and the collection does such an incredible job, not only as a place that brings together artifacts and maps and pictures and all that, but it's a prime research institution now that people can do all kinds of important work at. And right now, it's having a fabulous, fabulous exhibition on the origins of the city with a beautiful book to go with it. So bravo to you, Priscilla. And President Fitz and Emily and Tulane, thank you to all of you. Without Tulane, there would be no me. My parents met here 84 years ago, and it was here that they became partners. Daddy was the editor at the Hullabaloo, Mama was the woman's editor, and they launched their careers in politics from Tulane, forming the oxymoronic in Louisiana Reform Organization of the People's League to oust Huey Long's successors. Mama was actually from Point Cokie, Daddy was from Long Beach, Mississippi, but New Orleans quickly became home. And in fact, that's how we always referred to this city. It was just simply as home. Daddy graduated in the remarkable Tulane class of 1937 with so many men who made such an incredible contribution both to the city and to the country, not to mention the #1 student in the class, Marion Meyer Burkett, who just died last year at the age of 104. And she was the last surviving member of the People's League. But not long after that, just a couple of years after that, Daddy was elected to Congress, and the family relocated to Washington for part of every years. But always, it was New Orleans we called home, as in we're going home for the summer, which people thought was a little crazy. Or Daddy's home for a couple of weeks working in the office there. So the idea of a symposium on New Orleans as home made all the sense in the world to me. Over the years, as our family was devastated by the loss of Daddy, and transportation and the Congress both changed, it became Mama going home every weekend to her beloved house on Bourbon Street. I actually always loved shocking people with telling them that my mother lived smack dab in the middle of all the honky-tonk on Bourbon Street. When my children were small, we'd walk past them, strippers and other neighbors, and say, you know, through the woods and over the hills to grandmother's house we go. And then when she became ambassador to the Vatican and moved from Bourbon Street to the Vatican, I teased her that the costumes hadn't changed. It was still men in dresses. But it's a house that I have been going to since I was a small child because my great Aunt Frosty lived there. Frosty was one of a group of sisters, 4 sisters, 9 husbands, and they included, of course, my grandmother, and they certainly made this place a special home. Other than Frosty, who lived on Bourbon Street, the rest lived next door to us on First Street. And that's when the grand houses in the Garden District, many of them like ours, had been broken up during the Depression into apartments. And we lived in one of those apartments, and some people who weren't related to us lived in some, but most of them were related to us. And so it was a wonderful way to grow up. My great aunts would, between husbands, they would get together to vamp. That was the verb they used. They would vamp men. And these poor unsuspecting men, you know. We lived across the street from Mr. Crawford, who was blind, but they kept trying. And would go out in their negligees, you know. And when Steve and I got married, all the husbands were gone. And one of the mornings right before our wedding, they came down in their negligees to the breakfast table. And Steve had never seen anything like this before, right? I mean, he was at that point not acquainted with eccentric Southern women. He's gotten to know us well since. But and so my Aunt Eustacia looks at him and says, "Steve, I hear you have 2 grandfathers." And he allowed us how that was right. And she said, "Well, is either one of them creaky?" And he said, "Well, one of them was creakier than the other." And she says, "Well, that one's mine then." And she said, "Because, you know, Co, meaning my grandmother Corinne, she said, Co found them. Because they're Co's, Beau's grandfathers. So she gets the one that's not creaky." But you know, neither one of them snagged a man, but they had a wonderful time, and Steve had a wonderful time getting to know them and understanding what important people they were in my life, and he soon came to appreciate the place where they lived as we made many trips here, starting on our honeymoon, where we stayed at the Pontchartrain Hotel, and we came always, all the time, even in our early married days when we didn't have any money. And he came to understand what I had told him when we first met, and he was very clearly proud of what he considered his ethnicity as a Russian Jew. And I let him know that I was very proud of my ethnicity as a New Orleanian. And he found that an odd characterization, but you know it's true. It's absolutely true. I mean, being from New Orleans really is like an ethnicity. I mean, there's no other place that shares our character. Where else but in New Orleans would Mr. Okra become so famous that he has an obituary in the New York Times? I listen all the time to WWNO, and I am a member. I'm a sustaining member. But I do it not only to get the news of New Orleans, but also just to hear the names of the streets. I love the traffic report, particularly since I'm not in the traffic. But it's a really a way of just feeling close to home, and particularly since some of the streets are named after the family. It's a city of such wit and character. I mean, where else would a huge hole on one of the busiest streets be turned into the Cinco de Mayo Festival? And after Katrina, even as we dug out of the muck and misery, the world learned how really special we are, as the refrigerators were all over the streets with sassy sayings on them, and recipes were drying out on clotheslines because those were the sated family relics. Those were the things that were precious. When Mom and I came back soon after the storm hit, and it was still when cars were on top of cars and boats were all over the city, and it was just awful in every way, I must admit my most profound shock was the silence. I had never heard New Orleans silent. As a little girl, the vendors with mule-drawn carts went through the streets touting their wares, and then of course there've always been bands playing and noise. But even the playgrounds were empty because of course the children weren't here. And I remember hearing the sound of a single horn, and I just went to it because it was so welcome to hear that sound, and I saw it as a symbol of hope for this home. It definitely is an ethnicity, and people around the world, as Emily said, recognize it. You say you're from New Orleans, everybody knows where you're from. That's not true of Cleveland. And you know, you can't tell me another American city that boasts its own food, its own music, its own festivals, its own parades and parades and parades and parades, even its own language. I mean, shoot, every ward has its own language. As Emily was saying, you can tell where somebody grew up by the way they say the name of our city. You know that my pronunciation, New Orleans, is just pure 11th Ward. There it is, and it's different in every ward. Mama used to always joke that it was no surprise that it was hard for outsiders to get it right, because not only do we natives say the name of our town differently, but the same spelling defines Orleans Parish. And right down the street here is the Orleans Club, and they're all spelled the same way. My sister used to tell a story when we were all here for the Republican Convention in 1988, that some friend of hers was in a car wreck, and the ambulance drivers came up and said, where do you want to go? You want to go to Duro? You want to go to Hotel Dieu? And so whoever she was telling the story to said, well, the person must have been so relieved to hear about a hospital that had the name of God in it. And Barbara said, actually, most people from out of town don't know that we call God Dieu. And well, that venerable institution, the Hotel Dieu, of course, was sold to the state in 1992. But it's a fine example of the welcoming nature of New Orleans' home. It's a home that's opened its arms to all comers, as the Daughters of Charity did in their hospital when they founded it in 1859. And actually, the role of women religious in the founding and formation of this wonderful city has had a huge amount to do with why it is the welcoming place that it is. We all know the incredible work that now St. Catherine Drexel did in founding Xavier University, still one of the most exemplary institutions of higher education, producing the greatest number of African American doctors in the country year in and year out. But soon after the French settlers had set up their little outpost here, the moment we're celebrating in this tricentennial, the Ursulines arrived in 1727. Now think of it. Think of what it must have been to cross the ocean, the treacherous ocean, in those habits in 1727. But they got here. The colonists had asked the French government to send the nuns to staff hospitals for the military men stationed here. It was not something that was really in their playbook, but they did it. Haltingly, but within very few days after getting here, they set up a school for girls, being the first school for women and the first Catholic school in what would become the United States of America. And then in 1727, they began teaching and evangelizing African American and Native American girls as well. I mean, think of it. Right there at the beginning, they made it clear that they meant this to be a home for everyone here. And then when the colony changed hands from the French to the Spanish, the Ursulines went with the flow, bringing in Spanish nuns to make everybody feel comfortable. In fact, they made all comers feel comfortable, even as I discovered when I was researching one of my books, Aaron Burr, when he was on the lam from murdering Alexander Hamilton, and by the way, was plotting treason. Burr came to New Orleans to drum up support for the empire he planned to establish, and he visited the Ursuline convent at the invitation of the nuns. The saints had a desire to see me, he wrote his daughter. The bishop conducted me to the cloister. We conversed at first through the gates, but presently I was admitted within. Burr, I mean, a reprobate. There he found all was gaiety, wit, and sprightliness. After a tour of the convent, the nuns treated him to a repast of wine, fruit, and cakes, and promised to pray for him, which was a good thing because he was soon arrested. I was just night before last in Cleveland doing an event for the Ursulines there, and I said to them, you know, they thought they were doing something very cool because it was at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But I said to them, in Mardi Gras this year, there was an Ursuline float in New Orleans. So you all don't have a float. Of course, that visit from Burr came after the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, which in my view is really the beginning of multiculturalism in the United States of America. This city had already become such a rich gumbo of Native Americans, African Americans, Haitians, French, Spanish, Irish. The second governor under Spanish rule was Alejandro O'Reilly. Germans, including many German Jews joining their Sephardic brethren here. So it was already unlike any other place in the country. And New Orleanians were none too happy that strangers to their laws and manners, as well as language, had been sent to rule over them. That was written by the descendant of a Creole woman. But they offered no resistance, which was much to the relief and surprise of the Jefferson administration. We always made a big deal of the Louisiana Purchase in my family because my mother's maiden name was Claiborne. And we knew from babyhood the story of W.C.C. Claiborne rushing down the Mississippi to preside over the raising of the American flag. His brother Ferdinand came along to Louisiana as well and started my mother's direct line here. Again, when I was researching one of the books, I got what Paul Harvey used to call the rest of the story about W.C.C. Claiborne, which was, of course, he was from Virginia, and he had worked in one of the first Congresses as an assistant to the enrolling clerk. And he said he wanted to run for Congress, and the clerk said, well, you're from Virginia. There are too many people in Virginia running for Congress. Go to Tennessee. It's a new state, and nobody's there. And so he went to Tennessee, where Andrew Jackson had been the first member of Congress, but then he quit his seat and went to the Senate. And WCC was elected in a special election at the age of 23, which is, of course, younger than the constitutional requirement of 25, but there wasn't anybody else in Tennessee. And so he was seated in contravention of the Constitution. That was what the House ruled. Then comes the election of 1800, and his one vote from Tennessee was equal to all of the votes of Massachusetts and all of the votes of Virginia when the election was thrown to the House of Representatives as the tie between Jefferson and Burr. And everybody thought they could turn him. He was a Jefferson man, but everybody thought they could turn him because he was so young and incredibly vain, apparently. But he was not turnable, and he stuck with Jefferson for the 36 ballots, and within a month was named the governor of the Mississippi Territory. So it was just a straight political payoff, which is appropriate for Louisiana. And so that's how he got here. And I had always thought that the Purchase actually marked the beginning of our family's sojourn in New Orleans. But as I was doing the research for this talk, I actually learned that I have direct ancestors who called this great city home long before the Americans ever arrived, and who exemplify its diversity. One French ancestor joined Iberville to fight the English in Hudson Bay, and then came south where he married a Native American. A Swiss ancestor, Christian Ladner, was exiled to Louisiana in 1719 for smuggling, and some descendants think that Pass Christian is named for him. His son married a New Orleans girl who was baptized at St. Louis Cathedral in 1748 when she was 6 years old, and her father was a tailor in the city as early as 1726. And then there's a record of a German ancestor. These are all direct ancestors. I never knew them. They were dead. And he apparently was the creator of the first documented cotton gin, and he died here in 1776. So Claiborne was definitely a newcomer, but a newcomer the city made feel at home, especially after he married a very intriguing Creole woman. But unfortunately, Claiborne also takes us to a part of our history that for way too long made many of our neighbors feel like this was not a home that gave them warmth and nourishment. Though he welcomed the refugees from Haiti, Claiborne, as the first governor, tightened the horrific Code Noir, oppressing even further the already oppressed enslaved African and Native Americans, and he violently put down a slave uprising. The long arm of that history is still with us, and it's important, I think, as we talk about this home of ours, that we recognize the times when it shut out much of its population. I grew up here in the Jim Crow era. I remember well people moving the Johnny on the streetcar that said on one side for white patrons only, on the other side for colored patrons only. And white people would move it farther and farther back on the streetcar so that at crowded times, colored people would be huddled together, standing in the back. Even as a very little child, I was horribly offended by that, and my parents told me I should be. Of course, that's just a tiny indignity compared to the blatant and legal discrimination that kept so many of our people from the ability to live the lives they deserved and to cast the votes that as citizens they had the right to cast. The years of the civil rights struggles were tough ones for the city and for our family. It was hard to feel at home when people were so hateful to my parents because of their support of civil rights. It didn't feel very homey when someone burned a cross on our lawn. It was such a relief and really genuine joy when I started to feel at home again. When families like the Morials and the Landrews joined with my parents to do the yeoman work, along with a lot of other people in so many parts of the community, to bring the city together. It's work that we can't lose. We have to keep at it because it's so worth it. And we certainly can't let some stone figures of men dead many centuries now tear us apart as we look toward the future. This city can only be the home that beckons us if its rooms feel comfortable for all of its citizens, because it's our diversity that's made this place so unique. It's made this place unique. We might be very different people coming from very different backgrounds, but we know where we come from and where we always return. And when we join together in common purpose here in this great city, no matter wherever else we go, New Orleans always insistently calls us home. Thank you very much.